Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, November 7th, 2013. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. This week we go over the results from the Beer and Wine Journal Basic Brewing Radio IPA experiment testing the effects of adding increasing amounts of gypsum to the bottling bucket. Chris Colby and special guest Denny Conn will join me to help me make some sense out of the sensory data. If you're new to home brewing or would like to get into the hobby for the first time, check out our website, basicbrewing.com, where you can find archives of our audio and video podcasts and our DVDs to walk you through basic and more advanced brewing techniques. You can follow me on Twitter. My username is Basic Brewing, all one word. Also, you can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/basicbrewing.james. And our show page on Facebook is at facebook.com/basicbrewing. We're on Google Plus, too. And thanks to everybody clicking on the Amazon.com associate link on our basicbrewing.com site. You know how to work it. Whenever you think of Amazon shopping, go to basicbrewing.com first, and then click on our Amazon link. That will take you to Amazon.com, where you can shop as you normally do, not paying any extra, but helping to support this show, and greatly appreciate that. We also have associate links for Brew Your Own Magazine and the American Homebrewers Association on our site, too. And you can find our Basic Brewing iPhone app on iTunes, our Android app on Amazon.com. We're on the BlackBerry podcast directory, and we're on the Stitcher app as well. And we're on the Windows Phone directory, too. Check out our Brewer's Logbook at basicbrewingshop.com. In the front is a blank calendar that you can use to track your fermentations and plan your brews. And there's room in the back to log the details of up to 50 batches of brew. If you want to put a tip in our tip jar, some coinage in our guitar case, you can go to basicbrewing.com/support. And thanks to everybody who's done so already. Protect your precious beer with one of our growler bags. Check those out at basicbrewingshop.com as well. It's November, and you know what that means? Christmas time. Or at least that's what you'd think if you were watching TV in the United States right now. We're just skipping right over that little Thanksgiving holiday and going right into the one with all the shopping. So I'm thinking, why fight it? In order to get into the Christmas/holiday spirit, I'm cutting the pricing on our DVDs and DVD combos. So a couple bucks off each DVD. So if it's a single DVD, you save a couple of bucks. A DVD combo, multiply $2 times the number of DVDs. So you can save quite a bit on like a quad combo. I'm crazy, I tell you. So tell Santa, put basicbrewing.com, basicbrewingshop.com on your Christmas/holiday/end of the year list. Okay, enough commerce, enough intro. Let's get into the good stuff. As you have heard on this show a few weeks ago, we began an experiment between Basic Brewing Radio and Beer and Wine Journal to test whether adding gypsum to the bottling bucket would increase the hoppiness of an American IPA, and also what affects the ratio of gypsum or calcium sulfate to calcium chloride would have. And I invited a bunch of friends here locally to help evaluate the beers, and Chris Colby, editor of Beer and Wine Journal, and Denny Conn, homebrewing legend, to help go over the results. Well, Chris Colby, welcome back to Basic Brewing Radio.
Hey, James. Thanks for having me.
And Denny Conn, special guest this week. Welcome again.
Thank you very much. It's great to be with you guys here.
Now, you know why Chris is on the show. Chris helped design this experiment with the Beer and Wine Journal. And I wanted Denny to come on because he has been commenting frequently on the site and had some useful comments along with that first post talking about the introduction of the experiment. So I wanted to have you on to kind of give us some help in interpreting the results. And also, you're coming out with a book that's kind of along these lines, right?
Yeah. Drew Beecham and I are co-authoring a book called Experimental Brewing. And while we will cover some weird ingredients like Randy did in Radical Brewing, the main thrust of our book is to give people a framework to formulate their own experiments to make sure that their brewing techniques and ingredients are really working for them the way that they think they are, because we all know it's way too easy to fool yourself and think that something is working or isn't, you know, when you're that close to the beer.
Yeah, I wave a chicken bone over the fermenter every time I pitch my yeast.
Man, and I'll bet you every time it ends up making beer too. So I'd keep doing that if I was you.
Yeah, waving chicken bones causes alcohol to be created. So,
right. I've got a new chapter for the book now, James.
You're deluding yourself, James. It's turkey bones that really do it. You're obviously under the influence of a incredibly pernicious and wrong idea.
Well, Thanksgiving's coming up, so. But your book will help us to design experiments that are easy to follow and are built such that we don't have too many variables in there, so that we can kind of tell exactly what's going on at the end.
Yeah, that's really the gist of it. Is we're going to try and lay out a series of experiments you can do to make up your mind for yourself. We're not going to try and tell you should do things this way or that way or use this ingredient or that ingredient. We're going to give you a framework for you to make those decisions for yourself.
Excellent. Sounds right up our alley. So let's talk about this experiment. Chris, what did we do?
Okay, this experiment, we wanted to test the influence of water chemistry on brewing an IPA. Specifically, there's an idea that's sort of arrived in the homebrew community that the chloride to sulfate ratio in your beer influences the perception of, either influences the perception of bitterness or influences your perception of dryness, which secondarily influences your perception of bitterness. And so our idea was to our original idea was to, have a set of IPAs with different chloride to sulfate ratios in them and to, taste them. But we realized that, one way to do that would be to brew, at least two or more different IPAs and taste them. But we also realized the more beers you had to brew for the experiment, the less likely the experiment was ever going to, come to fruition. So we hit upon the idea of brewing one IPA and then bottling, adding sulfate in the form of gypsum, calcium sulfate, to the beer, so that we had an original beer brewed with a 1-to-1 chloride to sulfate ratio. In bottling the batch, you would bottle some of that. You would then add some gypsum to your beer, bottle another gallon of that, add a little bit more gypsum, and so on until you had 5 different beers with 5 different chloride to sulfate ratios. And not only did the ratio change, but the overall amount of sulfate changed too. Mm-hmm. So in this experiment, we can't necessarily say it's the ratio of these that's the, if we find any differences, we can't say it's the ratio specifically that's the thing or the amount, but we can say that your water chemistry affects, if we find any differences, that it affects your perception of the beer. And so the interesting thing, a couple interesting things about the experiment are, we're adjusting the ratio of minerals in the bottling bucket rather than in the boil or something. And that was one thing we didn't know if adding the minerals at that point was going to, if that point was going to have any effect, or if, you needed to put them in the mash, or you needed to, or at least put them in the boil. And that was the basis of our experiment. So we threw it out there. We gave people the numbers so that you could brew 5 gallons, how much gypsum you would have to add, each time to get to a 1-to-2, a 1-to-1, 1-to-2, 1-to-3, 1-to-4, and 1-to-5 ratio. And then with very little instruction on how to do the tasting, we released the experiment on the world.
I like that little sneaky disclaimer in there before we play the clips of people tasting.
Yeah.
So what?
We'll do better next time.
Well, what I did was I brewed your recipe that you recommended on the site. And I took my 5 beers on the road, and I went to Fossil Cove Brewery, where Andy Sparks, Ben Mills, Kimberly Johnson, and Kurt Castleberry tasted the beers. And then on another day, I went to the homebrew shop, where Alan Gann, Tony Canova, and Dave Justice tasted. And then Steve Wilkes and I sat down on another day here at the house and tasted the beers. And our conclusion was that the beers at that time were too cold. So it was very hard to figure out any differences. So we did a do-over. The next night, I let the beers warm up, and we did it again. So what you're going to hear now is the tasting at Fossil Cove, the tasting at the home brewery, and then the second tasting here at the house where Steve and I were joined by Alex Roberts. Okay, you guys introduce yourselves.
Hey, this is Andy Sparks.
Ben Mills.
Kimberly Johnson.
Court Castleberry.
We're here at Fossil Cove, and we have tasted the 5 samples of the Pale Ale. And first of all, what were your impressions? Were they remarkably different?
Yeah, they actually were really different. The mouthfeel, the flavors, the fruit notes, the hoppy notes, they were all really different.
Court, you spent a lot of time with your samples there.
Yeah, I mean, you could definitely tell a difference, but, kind of once you got it down to 2 or so, it's kind of splitting hairs.
Yeah, the same thing. I mean, the problem is these beers are very, very similar. The little differences are subtle, but they were different, right? And I just ranked them as far as the one I liked, the most hoppy one, kind of aromatically. Yeah, very cool.
It's really hard to do with an experiment like this, especially something on the cold side. You're changing something in the bottling bucket. It's real hard to come up with major differences because the yeast aren't acting on it and stuff. So you're basically just adding a mineral to a finished beer. So it is really hard to discern the differences. It's really just increase in mineral content. So you're basically...
Yeah, but you'd have to agree that it's pretty cool that by adding some minerals at the bottling bucket, you really do affect some of the aromatic qualities and the hoppy qualities of the beer.
Most definitely, because you figure most books you read say that mineral changes should be done in the mash tun or the brew kettle to affect the hoppiness later on, and to test it in the cellar is actually kind of a new-ish thing. Yeah.
Right. So does this mean in the future, if you've got a beer that you thought was going to come out really hoppy, doesn't come out quite where you wanted it, maybe you could add some gypsum or something to the bottling bucket and kind of fix the problem at the end. That's cool.
But the thing is, we don't know yet.
Well, we
don't know.
Well, all right.
Maybe the one we like the best is the one that didn't change.
Okay, so I'll let you guys score your own results, and at the end, I want you to tell me how many you got right. So can we do that? All right.
Oh, okay.
This will. We should probably. I probably should have prepared a little bit better before recording. Here we go.
How do we know what's right and what's wrong?
All right. I'm going to read off the most gypsum to the least gypsum. Okay. So we will go the most to the least. All right. You ready? All right, Ben. Are you ready? Pay attention here. All right. Are you ready? Okay. The most to the least. The most is B.
B had the most?
B had the most. D was the next.
Really?
A is the next. E is the next. C is the next. Kimberly, how many did you get right?
I got all of them right.
Did you really?
Yeah. I totally just can do this because I practice with coffee. So
Kimberly's a super taster.
Well, looks like we got a new addition to the tasting panel down here at the Cove.
This mouth. Yeah. This mouth.
How many did you get right, Ben?
Probably none. I think I was grading on a different scale.
Andy?
I got D right.
I got 3 right. 2 were flipped. It looks like I was tracking fairly closely to what it said. The main thing is that I did get the one with most gypsum is the one I scored as the most hoppy beer.
Court?
Yeah, the one that had the most I had as the most hoppy, but my other 4 were completely flipped.
So, Ben, did you get the most
Yeah,
gypsum?
I Also, it just had the most flavor. It had the most aroma. It was also a richer flavor too. So it was kind of more. It was fuller in the mouth. Whereas the one with the least E, I scored or 5C. Some of the ones that had the least amount of gypsum, I actually scored lower because they didn't seem to have quite as much aroma, flavor, especially the mouthfeel as well.
So while you guys weren't as perfect as Kimberly was, there were some general trends that sort of supported the hypothesis.
Yeah, so it seems to be that if you drive the gypsum up at the end, you can adjust the perceived hoppiness of the beer.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks.
And here we are in the back of the home brewery, and you guys introduce yourselves.
Tony Canova.
Dave Justice.
Alan Gann.
And you've sampled some hoppy beers here with varying levels of gypsum. And you guys have a less clean-cut result than we had at the Fossil Cove the other night. So first, give your impressions.
My impressions, the B, which had the most gypsum, was astringent to me. It had too much. The one with, I guess it was a 3-to-1 ratio, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
3. That was the best tasting one to me. The one with the 4-to-1 ratio, D, it seemed to have the most hop character to me without going over the top being astringent like B was. And that's about, the others were nondescript, I thought.
Yeah, I think I'm agreeing with Tony. At least on the 2-to-1 ratio has had the most pleasant hop character and flavor and bitterness altogether. A I found to be the most bitter, and that's a 3-to-1 ratio. And from there on, they were, the C and B were definitely harsh and unpleasant. So those were the higher ratios, I think.
Well, C was actually the least, and B was the most. So you didn't like either end of the spectrum.
Right. I think, yeah, there's a point to where it works, and then there's none or too much is not good.
So, Alan, did you see some trends? I mean, all of these tasted different.
Well, it looks like the ones that I picked, I picked A as what I perceived to be the most hoppy.
And that was right in the middle of the spectrum.
Yeah, right in the middle. So I kind of thought maybe there's a diminishing return once you put so much it doesn't help. But the second one I picked was E, which is the one in the second area. And it seemed like the ones with the least flavor or the least amount of gypsum were the ones I liked the most. But then when you got to the one that I put in the third area, I guess that was the C, that was the one with the least, and then I went with D, which had more than A as the next one, and 5 is the one, or the B was the one with the least. So it's kind of weird.
So it's a little confusing here. You guys kind of had different. It's almost like you guys had sort of different preferences.
Yeah, that probably plays into it.
Was it surprising to you guys that adding gypsum in the bottling bucket had so much of a difference?
Not really surprising. I don't think that's surprising. It's supposed to affect, the bitterness. And I found the most effect was in harshness. When you got to the higher levels, it was getting harsh and unpleasant. But lower levels, 2-to-1, 3-to-1, they had a good effect.
Is this gonna change your methods or?
No, I mean the only times I've ever used gypsum was I put it in the water before, in the hot liquor tank. I've never actually put it in on the back end.
Well, thanks, guys. It's a busy time back here in the.
Learn to homebrew day. We've got lots of people in and out, going back and forth. Dogs, all sorts of things.
I think this will encourage me to try a little more gypsum with hoppier styles. I usually don't add much, just like a half a teaspoon or something, but I think I'll increase that a little bit.
Yeah, I usually use calcium chloride, but I usually only use it in the mash. I use calcium chloride and gypsum, and depending on whether I'm making a malty beer or a hoppy beer, which one I'll add more of. I did just do a very similar experiment with this with a Mosaic IPA that I made, So and they're still in the secondary, so I'll be anxious to see how that turns out. So
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
I think you.
This is take 2 of the Spencer House tasting sessions. Steve wanted a do-over, so he's here. And Alex Roberts joins us. Welcome, Alex.
Hello.
Now, yesterday we were thinking that the beers were way too cold, so I let these warm up for 30 minutes, and my infrared thermometer said that it was about 50 degrees. So yesterday I picked the top bitterest one. Today I picked the top 2 most gypsumy ones. How'd you do, Steve?
I still bombed. I got none right again.
Well, but where did the most bitter? What'd you rank as the top?
I ranked the top one as what should have been the least bitter, which I didn't do yesterday. And I ranked the one that should have been the most. Well, now bitter's the wrong term. We're testing hop impact. So for me, although I got a different beer, but there was a beer in this row, in this set, that really stood out to me for hop bouquet. It just blew me away. It had so much hoppy, fruity goodness. When I smelled it, it was the one that should have had the least hop impact.
Or the least gypsum.
Or the least gypsum, right. So I guess what I'm saying is, perhaps to defend my score, that our palates perceive hops a little bit differently. And I am perceiving those volatile oils coming off the bouquet of the hop. I really got a strong impact from them, and they were very different to me. The flavor of the beers were very similar, and I really couldn't tell them apart. It was just, this one seems a little more bitter than that one, and I couldn't tell very much about it.
Alex?
Yeah, I guess it was interesting that Steve pointed out the aroma, because, I kind of thought, once you told us the experiment, what's the aroma going to have to do with this anyway, and why would it be different? But when I first started ranking them, I did look at aroma, and like he said, I noticed at least some of the ones that actually did correspond to my bitterness scale, that the ones I thought were more bitter had a kind of a sharper aroma to them, and the other ones were kind of more, I guess, a dull type aroma. But yeah, I mean, you could definitely, the nose was hit by kind of a sharp hop aroma, and so. But that being said, I only got the most bitter one right. But I found it to be probably 15 to 20% more than any of the other ones.
Wow. So, but you're not alone in doing that. On the first night, we got people that only found the most bitter one, or the most the hoppiest one they got right. That's what I did last night, and my wife Susan did also. So I mean, what were you looking for as far as the most hoppy? Were you looking at bitterness or overall hop character?
The notes I made on the one I found to be the most bitter, I thought it was like a fruity hoppiness. I mean, it was a cleaner hoppiness to it. And some of the other ones seemed a little dulled by malt. And I found a few that kind of had like a little chalky flavor to them. And I didn't notice that in the one the one I picked was most bitter the flavor was dominated by the hops. I agree that I got a chalky flavor from some of them, but I didn't interpret that. I didn't really think about that in terms of a hop characteristic, but I did get kind of a little bit chalky essence out of 2 or 3 of them than the other 2 or 3.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, today, since the beers were warmer, it was easier for me that some jumped out as being more. And when I say hoppy, I'm talking about bitterness, kind of a sharper bitterness, kind of a fuller, sort of, piney flavor or citrusy flavor, and it seems to me, and the one with the most gypsum jumped out today, and I got the first 2. So I don't know. Maybe there's something to this. Maybe.
Yeah, I think so. And I put the one with that should have been the most hop impact as number 2, as my second hoppiest. But I really keyed into that bouquet thing. That's what drove my order. So, there you go.
What do you think, Alex? Conclusions?
Yeah, it was interesting. Like I said, I thought the one that should have been the most bitter was definitely by a long shot on all the rest of them. And then the rest of them kind of muddled together. I mean, one I had as a 7 out of 10 as far as I ranked on the bitterness, and all the rest were 3 to 5, basically. And they all kind of stayed in that range as far as I was concerned.
All right. Thanks, guys.
You're welcome. Thank you.
So there you go. Some very interesting results that kind of I wish that I had just had Kimberly Johnson tasting this, and then I could have had 100% of the results 100% correct. But unfortunately, there were more variables entered into the equation, so to speak. So what did you guys, after you heard the reflections, the reactions from the tasters, what did you guys think? Denny?
I kind of felt like the opinions were all over the board and not really, I wasn't able to really reach a conclusion from anything. For instance, in that first group, there was one person who says all the beers were very different, and then the next person says they were all very similar. One person said the most gypsum had the most flavor and aroma, and that's a concept that I'm really not familiar with. I've always thought of gypsum as maybe enhancing bitterness or drying out the finish. Although, we have heard comments from Martin Brungard about how maybe by enhancing the bitterness, by moving the hops more forward and the malt into the background, that could play a part in increased perception of hop aroma and flavor. But again, what I really got out of it was that there was a big range of opinions there. There was a lot of there were a lot of preferences expressed, and that's fine. But damn it, I want hard facts.
We need digital tongues.
Oh, what a great idea.
We need a Kickstarter.
Yeah.
Well, one part of it may be my fault. I mean, because on the first one, I think at Fossil Cove, I said, find me the beers that are most hoppy. Rank the beers that are most hoppy. And then on the second one, at the home brewery, I said, rank them on hop presence or hop character. And so that's, those are different parameters, I think. Because I think, even though the guys ranked, Tony and especially Tony and Dave, ranked the beers as far as, the hop presence, being one of the ones without the most gypsum. In their notes that I have, they said that the one with the most gypsum was the most harsh. So, someone's hoppy, maybe another one's harsh. So that's interesting.
Yeah, it really is. And the other thing, this conversation we've been having with Martin today, he mentions that sulfate taste perception is affected by the cation it's paired with. Sodium sulfate is the most tasteable, followed by magnesium sulfate and calcium sulfate. So it's possible that if some of these people had higher levels of sodium or magnesium in their water than others, they would perceive the sulfate completely differently.
Yeah, so introduce the correspondence from Martin. We haven't mentioned that yet in the recorded conversation.
Basically, when I started hearing the results that you'd gotten, especially when I was hearing in that recording people talking about the effects on hop aroma and hop flavor, that was something that I just had never experienced myself or I'd heard anyone else mention. So the first thing I did was shoot an email to Mr. Water, Martin Brungard, to get his take on it. And his comments were very, very interesting. I don't know, you may even want to post the email, James, just so that people can see his comments. But he basically said that he had never really considered that also, but the effect of sulfate could synergistically enhance the hop flavor. And because flavor and aroma are so tied together, if it was in fact enhancing the hop flavor, it could possibly then also enhance the hop aroma.
Now, Chris, you had an opportunity. I sent 5 of the beers down to you, and you had an opportunity to taste those last night. What was your first person? What were your first person impressions?
Yeah, you sent me the beers, and you had, I knew what the experiment was, but you had labeled the bottles in letters and sent me the key, but I hadn't looked at it yet. So I was tasting the beers without knowing which was which, and I found out that I could taste differences between the two. But one thing I found out was that in trying to arrange them 1 through 5, my palate got very fatigued. I went through and tasted the beers several times and tried to arrange them in a 1 to 5 order. Then I would wait a couple minutes and try to arrange them again. And except for the lowest beer, which I seem to feel like I was pretty confident that was the least hoppy beer or the least dry beer. I really sort of, beyond knowing that the second one is hop beer, as I moved on, my palate just sort of got full of hops or something, and I came out with an arrangement. I got the lowest one, the one with the least amount of sulfate in it, right, every time, but my other results just bounced all over, and like the overall consensus was, instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, I had like 1, 4, 3, 5, and 2 was my consensus order. So I was off considerably. Although I did notice later when I checked on the results and arranged them in the correct order, I was just sitting around like reading Facebook and goofing around. And if I tasted the beers and let there be a couple minutes between tastings, I seemed to have a much clearer order. It seemed to make much more sense that was the right order. Although at that point I knew the results, so that can't be an experimental result. But I think the big results from the experiment are, one, like Denny said, there's variability. Some people taste more differences than others, which we know everyone's palate's different. 2, I think even the people who tasted the difference, for most people, I think if they expressed how large of a difference was, that it wasn't huge. Like, I could taste the difference between the least hoppy one and some of at least the least hoppy one and the number 4. That was a difference that I could clearly tell. But overall, the beers were similar. Yeah, I was just surprised. I think I was surprised a little bit that adjusting the mineral content in the bottling bucket actually did have an effect. Mm-hmm. I mean, even though it wasn't super clear, people couldn't pull out 1 through 5 and put them in a row. Most people could either sort of consistently identify either the most gypsumous or the least. And so I think, when I would say, in my recipes going further, brewing pale beers, I'm going to look at the amount of gypsum that I put in the beer. Also, look at the amount of chloride and have that not overwhelm the gypsum. And I think that if I ended up with a beer in the keg that was like close to getting the right hop character I wanted, but was a little off, I might try adjusting the amount of minerals in it, because my impression is it's not going to make hop bitterness appear out of nowhere that's not there in the beer. You still have to add the hops. But if you just need a little adjustment on how those hops come through, I think it would be possible to add, either add a little gypsum to get the hops to come through a little bit, or to add a little bit of chloride to maybe mute it a little bit. That's just my impression.
Yeah, I think that in looking at the results, you could say that out of the 11 people, or 12, I guess, including you, that 9 were able to either 9 including myself and my wife, 9 were able to either pick out the one with the most gypsum as being the most bitter or harsh. So I think that adding gypsum in the bottling bucket does make a difference on the final beer. It's just a matter of how much difference. I mean, the difference between even warm, when Steve and I and Alex tasted, the differences between the 5 samples were very small. I mean, it wasn't like one was just blasting out over another. Still spending a lot of time. It took a lot of time spending between the samples to come out with something that was, somewhat correct. And I get the top 2 out of 5. So, it's tricky.
So, James, what kind of absolute sulfate levels are we talking about? I mean, because the one report that you sent me that I saw, somebody's like maximum sulfate level was like 127 or 145, and to me that's pretty wimpy for an IPA.
Well, let me look that up.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. You're referring to Eric Hohenschuh, I'm going to say, from Port Jefferson, New York, who participated in the experiment. And he took kind of a different approach from what we did in that I think he tweaked, instead of just adding gypsum every time like we did to slowly build up a higher ratio of gypsum or sulfate to chloride, he tweaked both the chloride and the sulfate. So it kind of made it more complicated, and I'm not sure how we're going to blend that in with the conversation of our experiment. But he also had numbers in there, and I'm not sure how he got that. He said he got updated water profile after the beer was brewed from the local water authority. So maybe he's got some connections. But but one thing that Eric did say said after a few sips, the beers are generally very similar. In this very hoppy ale, after a few sips, the beers are really becoming very difficult to distinguish. So. He said for this particular beer, the 1-to-1 ratio was initially the most drinkable, as the sweetness from the malt was in better balance to the bitterness from the hops. And I also want to mention, can't forget Brandon Dufala from Greenville, South Carolina, who also participated. And he followed more of our technique or our procedure, and he actually had kind of a different impression from the consensus of what we found out. He said the results seem to show that the more calcium sulfate that is added, the less sharp the bitterness becomes. The perception of bitterness in the 1-to-2 to 1-to-5 changed slightly as the beer warmed. However, the 1-to-1 remained the most distinctive. He said,
we don't see anything about his absolute levels, though, do we?
No, there may be something that we can determine. No.
On the way that we had, if he followed our experiment, we had 50 parts per million of chloride, and then the sulfate varied. So the 5 bottles, there were 50, 100, 150. 200 and 250 parts per million of the sulfate.
Okay.
And the same, and then 50 parts per million of chloride the whole way through. So that gave us the 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, ratio of 1-to-2, 1-to-3, 1-to-4.
And the last note from Brandon's results, he said the differences in the samples were so slight that if you weren't spending the time to sip each individual sample, you would never know the difference. So there's another voice saying that the samples are very close together. And if you were to given one bottle one night and another bottle the other night, maybe you couldn't tell the difference.
Right.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I was going to say, in terms of absolute amount of sulfate, 250 is getting up there, but it's not necessarily like way up into the range that some people do. I know some people think like 300 is a pretty good number, or 350, right around in that range. So 250 is getting up there in overall gypsum content, but not it's not at the high range or above, what people would try to brew in a beer like that.
Yeah, I've personally come to the conclusion that for my IPAs, I like 300 to 350. So what I was getting at originally was, at least with the one result, I can't remember the gentleman's name here, Eric's. His absolute sulfate levels were 90, 108, 121, 127, 105. Those are all so close that, I can see how it might be kind of difficult to distinguish between them. At least based on my theory that it's the absolute numbers more than the ratio that matters.
So it's not the ratio of the chemicals, it's the minerals, it's the amount.
The amount that you end up with. That's really what I've found. And again, this is based on some playing around I did with my beers for the last year. After talking to Martin, he was saying that he generally prefers to keep the chloride levels well below 100. So if you were trying to get more sulfate into your beer while maintaining the ratio that you thought was the right way, you would eventually end up getting those chloride ratios into an undesirable, or chloride numbers into an undesirable ratio. So what I've been working with is just not even thinking about the ratio and trying to keep my chloride levels constant while just increasing the sulfate.
But in a way that's working in the ratios, though.
Oh, sure. Yes, of course, you're changing the ratio. But I guess what I'm getting at is a lot of people, for instance, decide that an IPA should have a, say, sulfate to chloride ratio of 1.2 to 1 or whatever. So if you get too hung up on the fact that that's the right ratio, but then you still don't have enough sulfate, you'll be bringing up your chloride along with it. You have to get past the concept of looking only at the ratio and looking at the absolute numbers that you're adding.
I see. So if you've got a small amount of minerals and the ratio is correct, it's not going to make as big of an impact as if you had a larger amount of minerals and the ratio is correct.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that would make another interesting experiment.
Yeah, Andy Sparks was saying after, of course, maybe he said it on the recording, but he was, of course, he's a hophead and he likes bitter beers and hoppy beers, and so he was saying, wow, what if we add twice as much, gypsum in the bottling bucket? What happens? And then 3 times as, so he was
right on.
He was ready to blow it out and go into the next level.
Yeah,
that wouldn't be too hard to do. And I mean, you've already got the bottles. Just open them up, pour. If you had a decent scale, you could even add more gypsum to your bottles. Recap them. You'll lose a little bit of carbonation, but
it's
especially
definitely easier.
Adding the gypsum in there, that'll probably make it gush.
Yeah, it's definitely easier to do it in the bottling bucket.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, what conclusions can we take out of this? What's the takeaway?
For me, there would be 2 things. One thing is that the water chemistry does matter. It didn't change the overall. It didn't greatly change the perception of these beers. I mean, it didn't make them seem like, the one was, an Ironger Oktoberfest, and the other one on the other end was a, what's that one Vinny brews, Russian River, Pliny. It wasn't that kind of difference. It was more like here's a series of IPAs, and the least one to me, it was still bitter. It still had hops. It just felt like the body and mouthfeel of the beer was interfering with them a little bit. Whereas to me, the most bitter one, when I had it properly identified, this tasted like the relative dryness of the beer got out of the way so that the hops could be tasted more clearly. And so, yeah, I think the two things, like I said, one, it does make a difference, although not a monumental one. And two is you can do adjustments in your bottling bucket if you want, or your keg, which was a little bit surprising to me.
Or even in your glass, which I've done several times.
So instead of a salt shaker, you could have a gypsum shaker right there by your glass.
Right. Well, John Mayer is noted for carrying around a vial of hop oil, so why not a shaker of gypsum?
Why not a drywall Randall?
To him. That's a great idea. For me, I got a couple takeaways also, and the first one is the same as Chris: is that adjustments to your water can make a difference, but maybe you have to make a very radical adjustment to make a radical difference. The other thing that kind of leaves me wondering about the results here is that we don't know anything else about the rest of the water that these people used. And the point that Martin Brungard made about the interaction of various cations with sulfate could, to me, explain some of the differences in the results that we got. But we don't really know because nobody reported their full water profile.
Well, if it helps, I used RO water from the store.
Okay, well,
if they followed our experimental protocol, it was to start with distilled water and to build it up with calcium chloride and gypsum.
Okay, I'd forgotten that. So, and there were no sodium additions or anything like that.
No sodium, no magnesium.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if they followed the protocol, they should have been starting out with a fairly clean slate.
Well, in that case, my other conclusion then would be tastes is weird.
Yeah.
That's a shirt.
Yeah.
Tastes is weird.
That's right.
That may be the title of the show.
Yeah, and I know right after this, I'm gonna go to the hardware store and get one of those little water filter things and make me a drywall Randall so that I can just push the beer through gypsum.
Talk about some cloudy beer, Chris.
Yeah.
Just close your eyes.
Extra chunky style IPA.
There you go.
All right. Well, this has been fun, if nothing else, and it's definitely given me some ideas going forward.
I really commend you guys on undertaking this. I think it was a great concept, and I think that even though the results were mixed, they point in at least the direction of being able to adjust your water or your finished beer, making a difference. And it might be worthwhile to try and come up with a more closely controlled version of this and do it again.
Yeah, one thing I learned when I was actually in science is that whenever you do an experiment, like right when you finish, that's when you realize the experiment you should have done. You get done putting all this work into something, and then you're like, you know what I should have done?
Yeah. I think that's true of life in general, Chris.
Yeah.
Right at the end, we'll get it right.
Yeah, you can, and this would be a great experiment to rerun. Like, for example, I never got around to brewing the experimental beers, so maybe I'll do that. And instead of having the amount of gypsum go up, I'll do it where I'll very simply the ratio, but leave the overall level of minerals the same, so that try to keep chloride under 100, but see what I can do to just have the overall amount of minerals stay the same, but just vary the ratio, because that would be an interesting one.
Well, if you do that, send me some to taste.
Yeah, and I do want to send you a 5-pack of these as well, Denny, so that I've got
great.
some left over, so that maybe that's a follow-up discussion on the at least on the website to see what you think. and whoever else you can rope into tasting them too.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I have a couple of good friends who are national BJCP that live near me that I'd love to have do it also.
There you go. Love to have you do it. Well, thanks, guys.
Thanks for having me on.
Great pleasure. I'm more than happy to do it anytime you need me, James.
Awesome. Well, thanks again to Chris and Denny and everybody who took part in the tasting, and especially thanks to Eric and Brandon for brewing up the experiment, sharing the results. Brandon is putting together a series of YouTube videos about the experiment as he did it. And his channel is at youtube.com/nowitstimeforbeer. It's all one word, of course. So looking forward to seeing that. I've seen the first episode, and he puts a lot of effort into his videos. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to james@basicbrewing.com or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. Our Basic Brewing growler bags are available in our shop. Protect your precious homebrew and craft beers. You take it from place to place. Check out our support link where you can throw a couple of bucks into the tip jar by subscribing financially to our podcast. And be sure to check out our DVDs, Extract Brewing and Partial Mashing, Stepping into All Grain, All-Tech Lagering and Decoction Mashing, and Introduction to Wine Kits. You can find them all on our site at a new discounted price for the holidays. Got combo deals to save you a few bucks if you want to buy more than one DVD at a time. And you can check out our shirts in the store as well. Our logbooks are on the store too. Keep track of up to 50 batches of beer. You can see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com. And if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order them online at our online shop at basicbrewingshop.com. Thanks to everybody who's continued to click on our Amazon.com link. We appreciate the support there. Our featured products this week that were purchased through the link are Yamaha RX V375 5.1 channel 3D AV home theater receiver, black, and Regency roasting bag with oven safe twist tie, turkey size. Somebody's thinking about Thanksgiving. Thanks again, everybody, and remember, I can't tell who bought what, so no worries there. Just click on the Amazon.com logo on our site the next time you feel like Amazon shopping. We greatly appreciate your support. Don't forget you can also join the American Homebrewers Association and subscribe to Brew Your Own magazine through the associate links on basicbrewing.com. That's all until next time. Until then, thanks for listening, everybody. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dodson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. So long.